Welcome back to our channel. Before we begin, take a second to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Not because this channel needs it, but because some part of you keeps searching for language that explains things you've never fully been able to explain yourself. There are people who can sit in a room full of tension and somehow become the calmest person there. Not because they're peaceful. Not because nothing affects them. But because somewhere along the way, they learned how to disappear emotionally before things got too overwhelming. You see it in small ways first. The way they laugh during serious conversations. The way they say "I'm fine" too quickly. The way they comfort everyone else while quietly feeling nothing themselves. Or maybe worse, feeling everything at once but showing none of it. And people usually misunderstand this. They think it means you're cold, detached, hard to read, maybe even emotionally unavailable. But that's rarely what's actually happening. Because some people aren't hiding their feelings from others. They're hiding them from themselves. And the strange part is, they often become extremely functional because of it. Reliable under pressure. Good during emergencies. Easy to depend on. The person who keeps everything together when everyone else falls apart. But there's usually a reason for that. A deeper one. And most people never notice it because emotional suppression doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like maturity. Sometimes it looks like self-control. Sometimes it looks like being the strong one. But there's a difference between emotional stability and emotional shutdown. And people confuse the two all the time. Suppressing feelings is one of the most socially rewarded survival patterns a person can develop. Especially early in life. If expressing emotions once led to conflict, or rejection, or embarrassment, or punishment, the nervous system adapts. Not consciously, quietly, a child learns that certain emotions create danger. So the brain starts rerouting them. Anger becomes silence. Sadness becomes productivity. Fear becomes hyper-independence. Disappointment becomes numbness. Over time, the person stops expressing emotions, not because they don't exist, but because the brain decided expression was unsafe. And eventually something even stranger happens. They lose immediate access to what they feel entirely. Not permanently. Just enough to function. Neuroscience has actually observed this pattern in people who experience chronic emotional invalidation or prolonged stress environments. The brain becomes more focused on regulation and survival than emotional processing. In simple terms, the nervous system starts prioritizing control over expression. That's why some people genuinely don't know what they feel until hours later. Or days later. Sometimes they only realize they were hurt after the situation is already over. Sometimes the body notices before the mind does. Tension headaches, jaw clenching, random exhaustion, a heavy feeling they can't explain. Because emotions that aren't processed don't disappear. They relocate. And the scary part is, emotional suppression can make someone look incredibly composed from the outside, even while they're internally disconnected. That's the contradiction people don't talk about enough. The person who seems the least emotional is often carrying the most unprocessed emotion. Not always loudly. Sometimes silently. Like background noise they've learned to live with for so long, they no longer notice it's there. And if this pattern became deeply wired early enough, suppressing feelings can start to feel more natural than expressing them. Vulnerability begins to feel unfamiliar. It's not wrong, just unsafe. So instead of saying "that hurt me," they intellectualize it. Instead of crying, they get tired. Instead of asking for help, they isolate. Instead of feeling anger directly, they become emotionally distant without understanding why. And because they still function, because they still show up, because they still smile and respond and handle responsibilities, Nobody notices the emotional cost. Not even them sometimes. But suppression has a quiet side effect people rarely expect. You don't only numb painful emotions. You slowly numb positive ones too. Excitement becomes muted. Connection feels harder to access. Even joy can start feeling strangely far away. Because emotions don't exist in isolated compartments. The brain doesn't perfectly block only sadness while leaving everything else untouched. When the nervous system learns to reduce emotional intensity for survival, it often reduces all emotional intensity. Which explains why some people feel emotionally flat in moments that are supposed to make them happy. And then they feel guilty for that too. But guilt misses the point. This pattern usually began as intelligence. Adaptation. A nervous system finding the safest way available to survive emotionally complicated environments. Some people learned very early that being emotional made situations worse. So they became observant instead. Careful instead. Useful instead. Easy instead. Not fake. Adaptive. There's a difference. And honestly, many emotionally suppressive people become deeply empathetic because they spend years studying other people's emotions while disconnecting from their own. They become excellent listeners. Emotionally intuitive. Good at sensing tension before anyone says a word. But terrible at answering one simple question. How are you really doing? Because they genuinely don't know sometimes. Not in a clear way. Their emotions became something monitored from a distance, instead of experienced directly. And eventually, they start believing this is just their personality. That they're naturally detached. Naturally private. Naturally numb. Maybe partly. But sometimes what feels like personality is actually adaptation repeated for so long it became identity. And none of this means something is wrong with you. That's important. Emotional suppression is not proof that someone is broken. It's proof the brain learned a strategy and got very good at it. The problem is simply that survival strategies don't always disappear after the danger does. The nervous system keeps protecting you long after the original environment is gone. That's why some people still minimize their emotions, even around safe people. Why they still say it's nothing when it clearly is something. Why being cared for can feel uncomfortable. Why emotional honesty can feel strangely exposing, even when nobody is attacking them. Because the body remembers experiences the mind has normalized. And healing, for many people, isn't becoming more emotional overnight. It's slowly realizing they were allowed to have emotions in the first place. Allowed to feel anger without becoming bad. Allowed to feel sadness without becoming weak. Allowed to feel overwhelmed without losing worth. That realization alone changes something quietly. Not instantly, but deeply. Because once a person understands their emotional suppression as a nervous system response instead of a character flaw, the shame around it starts loosening. And shame is usually what keeps the cycle alive. Maybe that's why some people feel strangely emotional when they finally feel understood. Not because someone fixed them, but because their inner world stopped feeling invisible for a moment. And if any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, there are probably other patterns you've normalized about yourself that have deeper roots than you realize. If this kind of content speaks to you, you already know what to do.